So I'm going to make an argument today for the beauty of cultural fluidity. I've been fascinated / appalled by kind of the discussion around cultural appropriation in relationship to the art world. I've had a lot of those discussions, and they never end well. Nobody changes their mind because the discussion is framed as anti, I'm anti-cultural appropriation, etc. So you're making a case against something. So I wanted to just try to make the case for cultural fluidity and all of the amazing things that it brings. And I'm going to do it in relationship to this book that I'm writing, which is a sequel to Journey to the West, called Journey to the West, American Demons, as well as a movie I'm going to be showing at Stray Cat, which is the first ever Chinese animated film that was made in 1941 called Princess Iron Fan, which is one of the more famous chapters out of Journey to the West. So let's just start there with this movie. This movie is in the public domain. You can download it for free online. I'll put a link to where you can do that. And the history of Chinese animation is interesting. It's, nobody really thinks of the Chinese in terms of the world of animation. You have anime coming out of Japan, and you've got kind of the rich cultural history surrounding that, but in China, it's a much different story. And a good place to begin that story is with this movie, Princess Iron Fan. It was done by the Wan brothers, who ran kind of the most advanced animation studio in China during that time. They were also responsible for making Upward Heaven in 1964, which was another Journey to the West adaptation. But yeah, so Princess Iron Fan, 1941, they didn't have as many examples of what animation was like. And one of the main ones and that they pulled from were the Fleischer Brothers. The Fleischer Brothers most famously did Popeye and Betty Boop. They're, two Jewish brothers that made some amazing cartoons. I think some of the best animators of their time and even today. If you've never watched early Betty Boop cartoons, it's really worth checking out. There is a stark line between early Betty Boop cartoons and the later Betty Boop cartoons because the censors took over and they imposed all sorts of strange sanctions. So Betty Boop turned from this kind of wild and crazy nightlife living, short skirt wearing Jewish girl to a housewife in a long dress that lives with a dog. That never goes out. So late Betty Boop cartoons are pretty boring, and it's pretty much killed her character. That's a whole nother story. But the Fleischer Brothers were a big influence on these Chinese brothers that were animating a story that was written in the 1600s. Right? In the story that was written in the 1600s, nobody... it's attributed to Wu Qian'an. Nobody knows if that's actually true or not. And it almost doesn't even matter because these are stories, they're folk tales. They're Chinese folk tales that were written down and preserved. And whatever the author did during that time, they looked around China and, there was Buddhist schools of thought, there was Taoist and Shintoism, right? And there are these three formulations of how the world was organized, and he just kind of mashed them together, and took all these stories, took all the characters from all these disparate realities, and just shoved them together and put them in the story and made it work. And even some of the characters in Journey to the West. For instance, the most famous character in Journey to the West, which is Monkey, right? So Monkey is not even originally a Chinese character. He's mostly derived from, and I'm not going to be able to remember, his name, but there is a character in Hinduism that is a mischievous monkey that flies around on a cloud, that has a stick, that gets into all sorts of adventures. And that character, they basically borrowed that whole conception, imported him over into China, and reinvented him, and gave him a better story. From my perspective. And so the whole thing is just this cobbled together mishmash of all these different cultures in the 16th century, right? And then you have these Chinese brothers in 1941 trying to interpret this mishmash of a story by referencing the animating style and techniques of two Jewish brothers that were making really silly Betty Boop cartoons, and informing that. And that's Princess Iron Fan. And then, if you want to extrapolate further, you've got me, who's a 39-year-old Jewish man that lives in Kansas City in 2019, watching a 1941 movie, being inspired by all of these stories, and then deciding to reinterpret them in a modern American context. Right? That whole progression, that's the beauty of having cultural fluidity. It creates these things that you could never possibly dream of. And that no one could ever think up. The internet does this, I think, at a much more rapid pace. All of the memes, all the internet memes now that get thrown out there that just seems so arbitrary and so silly, but also so perfect. It comes from the same convulsing mishmash of the fluidity of all of this cultural transmission. So that, I think, is the best argument for it, which is that this is a complex reality that I don't really understand. Nobody understands it because nobody can predict it, right? You can't predict what the next viral meme is going to be. If somebody truly understood it, then you could just manufacture these things. So nobody understands it. Partially also because the context itself is mutating and changing to our understanding of it. And so even if we do seemingly get a good grasp on what's happening, knowing how it works in that moment will forever change it into the future and make it a new thing. But there are some people that have a problem, I don't think, with that overall structure. They just see that there's certain bad moral outcomes that come out of this, that there's this chaos in which they identify exploitation that happens within this chaos. Specifically exploitation of outgroups that are on a perceived higher level of power, I guess is the best way you could describe it. And so a natural response to the unfairness of that situation is to say, well, we should put a stop to it. We should put a stop to, let's say, white people borrowing Mexican culture and using it to profit off of. Or you could just name any culture in there, Asian culture, or and that this is a problem, and that but the unsaid part of this argument is, in imposing those restrictions, and these restrictions are not legal, they're social, that are mostly reinforced by some kind of collective shame. That doing that is worth possibly injuring the cultural fluidity and all of the amazing things it creates. And so there's a number of problems that if you go down this path, you have to address. One of them is, of course, you get trapped in group definitions and trying to decide, who is actually black? What does that mean? Who actually participates? Is there a black culture? How do you participate in that? You get, and all of those questions have partially rational answers, but the edges are fuzzy on all of it. And so it gets really hard to enforce the rules as you apply them with a social shame mechanism. And the people that are adverse to this approach immediately notice how biased the application of it is because of the fuzziness of all of these variables that surround this problem. So the way I think about it is, one, I love the beauty and what fluid cultural transmission can create so much that I am wary of imposing anything on that system or on anyone else. Secondly, it's just like, I can't imagine, as somebody that spends their life thinking about and making things, and making things, it's just so much extra effort to then also take it as a responsibility to police and publicly morally shame and judge the other things that people are making around me. It just seems like such a waste of time. I would just so much rather try to work on and perfect the things that are meaningful to me. So anyway, I'm not going to make it's so hard not to do this, but I'm not going to go down the negatives, all the negatives of how of why I think this is a bad approach. But I do think it's underappreciated, and there is a strange discrepancy between these memes that we have of liberal and conservative, where liberals are or progressive. I mean, those aren't interchangeable terms, but that's too complicated to get into. That they're more free, they're more open to new experiences, they're more tolerant of ambiguity and this kind of creative, destructive mishmash thing. That should be their ideal environment, right? And that conservatives are more orderly, they want more strict categories, they are less conducive to ambiguous situations, they want to clarify, right? That's those two personality types, those are somehow attached to those two labels of liberal, progressive, and conservative. But they switch sides here, right? Because for whatever reason, and this has totally switched in my lifetime, where conservatives are now making the same cases that liberals were making when I was a kid over, Madonna having sex with a black Jesus, and the piss Christ, and gangster rap, and Salman Rushdie. All of these iconic artists who were also kind of blending all of these different cultures together and coming up with new, more ambiguous transformations of these things. They were tolerated. They were seen as champions of this liberal ideal. And the conservatives looked at that as kind of a destruction of the moral order. It was very steeped in Christianity and family values. That has all switched, where now you have conservatives making arguments about freedom of expression, and more liberally minded people wanting to have stricter categories and more morally righteous punishment around free expression, and this creative thing that artists go through. And I think a lot of people of my age are just baffled by this. And it's part of, I think this is the benefit. I mean, if there's any sort of benefit in getting older, it is watching the transformation of rational debate between these two sides completely flip, right? Because that should not be possible. If you are following a philosophical ideal that you are trying to enact from a political perspective, it should not be possible for things to flip 180 degrees and you're all of a sudden on the other end of the spectrum. So anyway, I care about these ideas a lot. I think it's important. I think it was one of the things that really made it attractive to me as a project to start writing this book, because how do you translate a 16th century Chinese novel into something that is contemporary, to not just, and it is not just faithful to the American experience, but to the original characters and text. And I mean, what it did was it sent me researching, right? Because going through this process of being someone in the out group, and, you know, I'm not obviously Chinese. I'm also not from the 16th century. Being in the out group in a lot of different ways has its disadvantages, it has its advantages. The disadvantages, you know, are that you don't know this stuff as well as somebody who has grown up with it, right? Somebody who, from 6 years old, their parents sat them down and told them these stories, the stories of Monkey and Pig and the characters in Journey to the West and Princess Ironfang and the Bull Demon, that these are characters like Santa Claus and, you know, God, I don't even know who you have anymore. St. Patrick. I mean, it's hard to translate. I mean, it is religious. Jesus, maybe Mary. So you don't have that. But what it made me do, as someone from being outside of that group, is it made me research it. Like, I really wanted to find out all about this, right? So I researched kind of Buddhist conceptions of how heaven is constituted, what Buddhist hell is like, you know, all the hierarchy of all of the people involved, right? So this was taking on that project is not, I mean, it's an eye-opening experience. It's one that if you're interested in breaking down barriers and having in-groups and out-groups understand one another, you would want somebody to undergo this process. What you wouldn't want to do is say, you have no right to touch this story, therefore, hands off, right? If I felt that way, you know, I never would have undertaken this. I never would have done all the research, and I would know so much less than I do now. But there are advantages. There are advantages to being an out-group person looking in, right? Because often what happens is in-groups cannot see their own biases. Right? If everyone has the same bias, it becomes almost impossible to see. And sometimes it does take someone from the outside looking in to make those kinds of, you know, wide-eyed, is that the right term? New-eyed? Wide-eyed? Fresh-eyed? Observations. That's a real thing. You know, not that I feel like I have that I have some deep insight into Chinese culture, because I don't. But that is a possibility in other contexts, such as the political context that we find ourselves in. Like, I think all four political groups have interesting, insightful criticisms of what the others are doing. Progressives, liberals, conservatives, libertarians. Like, there are stupid people in all four of those groups making really bad arguments that are not worth paying attention to. But there are also intelligent people in each one of those groups that have an out-group status that has some really insightful things to say about what they see going on in that group that that group itself can't see. I sometimes feel like when I read the paper, you're just constantly dealing with this conflict of these, what people call the culture war, which I think is probably a fairly bad meme to frame this as a war, because it's, well, for a lot of reasons I think that's bad. But it's like watching a couple that's never gone through marriage counseling or has no idea how to actually fight, right? And they just, like, all criticism they just take intensely personally, and they don't take it and they just attack one another, and then point out the easiest, most stupidest thing that person had said maybe a week ago, instead of addressing the more complex, insightful thing that person just said. I really do feel like that's what we're living through. So yeah, I think that in-group, out-group relationship is more complex than to say people who have in-group status, such as I'm Jewish, so that's my group of people. I have the right then to comment on them because I have a lived experience of what it's like, therefore I have more direct knowledge, and that people that don't have that should refrain from commenting on it. If you're a writer, you might refrain from putting a Jewish character in your story. I mean, it goes pretty far in terms of the restrictions that you think should be applied. But again, I think what's missing there is that, like, as a Jewish person, it would be interesting to have someone, that was from Nigeria, like, suddenly watch Seinfeld and then, knowing nothing of Jewish culture, try to make the Nigerian version of Seinfeld, right? Or write a character, a Jewish character based off of limited knowledge. Like, you will make, like, weird things are going to happen out of that. And maybe 99% of them are bad. Bad in the sense that they're just not interesting. But the possibility of interesting cultural creations of that fluidity, to me, is just too enticing to want to try to police that from my own in-group, right? I would be more excited to get to read somebody's terrible translation because they don't know what the hell they're talking about. Those things can be interesting. And you see this, you see, like, Americans' obsession with Italian Westerns, or Trolls 2, which was made by was an Italian couple, right? Where there's just like this lost in translation moment where you have, it just creates funny things, and we like to laugh at it. And that seems like an undeniably good thing in the world. And the hurt that causes seems negligible in relationship to the possibility of really creating something interesting and just the joy that all of the weirdness brings to people. So that's all I have to say. But you should watch Princess Iron Fan. Let me know what you think. You should read Journey to the West. Journey to the West, there's a very shortened version of it called Monkey that's been condensed down to 300 pages. It was condensed down by this Englishman who translated the story and edited it. And you know what? He did a great job of editing it. The only problem is that he took out the poems that are interspersed with the text, but otherwise the book needed editing, and he did a great job. It's 2,635 pages, and he nailed it down to like 300. And then also read my book. It's free, and I think it's pretty good. Journey to the West, American Demons. You don't have to read the original text. It does make it a lot funnier. It is a comedy. And it follows all of the characters from that story through the American South and their interaction with everyone they meet. So, I guess I'm going to clean up.